There is a quiet kind of question that sometimes appears in the mind without warning. How do I stay true to myself when someone disrespects me in front of everyone? It doesn't arrive with loud anger or big speeches. It comes in those small, uncomfortable moments when you feel your face getting warm, your chest tightening, and your thoughts scrambling to decide what to do next. You don't want to explode. You don't want to stay silent, either. You just want to keep your dignity without losing your humanity. I once saw an interview with Keanu Reeves where someone was trying a little too hard to be clever at his expense. The comments weren't cruel, but they were sharp, just close enough to disrespect to make the room feel slightly tense. There was a subtle mocking tone, the kind that invites an audience to laugh along. I remember watching him carefully. He didn't fight back. He didn't rush to defend his ego. He didn't try to outshine or outwit the other person. Instead, he did something that, at first glance, looked almost like nothing. He listened. He smiled softly. He responded with a kind of gentle clarity that neither attacked nor surrendered. There was no bitterness in his face, no forced laugh. He stayed present, but he didn't participate in the disrespect. The moment passed, and the conversation moved on. It would be easy to overlook that as unimportant, but I didn't. I replayed that moment in my head more than once. Because beneath the surface, something meaningful was happening. Respect was being quietly tested in public, and he answered without noise. That stayed with me. Not because he was a celebrity, but because the reaction felt deeply human and deeply rare. Years later, I found myself in a situation that, in a smaller, everyday way, carried the same energy. It happened in a meeting at work. The details don't really matter, because the scene is universal. We were sitting around a table, people scrolling through their phones, shuffling papers, pretending to listen more carefully than they actually were. I had shared an idea I'd been working on for days. It wasn't perfect, but it was thoughtful and sincere. As I finished explaining, one of my colleagues, someone who often enjoyed being the loudest voice in the room, leaned back in his chair, smirked slightly, and said, "Wow, that's ambitious," in a tone that made it sound like a joke. A few people laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was easier to laugh than to confront the discomfort. In an instant, I felt that familiar wave inside, heat rising to my face, a sharp ache in my chest, words rushing to my tongue, not yet formed but already colored by defensiveness. Part of me wanted to reply with something equally sharp. Another part wanted to shut down, withdraw, and never speak up again. There I was, in the quiet middle of a very common human test. When respect is brushed aside in public, what do you do with your heart? The room went silent for a brief second, the kind of second that stretches far beyond its actual length. I looked at him, looked at the others, and then felt something unexpected rise. Not anger, not shame, but a kind of inner pause. A small space between what I felt and what I could choose. In that space, I remembered that interview, that simple, unforced presence I had seen years ago. Not the details, not the words, just the feeling of someone who didn't let another person's energy decide his character in that moment. So I took a breath. Instead of pushing back, I said, calmly, "Maybe it is ambitious, but I think it's worth exploring. If there's something specific you think won't work, I'd really like to hear it." My voice wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp. It was steady, though I could feel my body shaking slightly inside. I wasn't pretending the comment hadn't stung. I was simply choosing not to answer it with more of the same. The room shifted, very slightly. He hesitated. The smirk on his face softened, almost disappeared. He tried to add a few practical objections, but now the tone was different. Other people began to ask questions about the idea itself. The focus moved away from the mockery and back to the work. That meeting ended like any other. No one stood up and applauded my self-control. No music played in the background. The world didn't change. I walked back to my desk and sat down, heart still beating a little too fast. But something inside me had quietly rearranged itself. Later that evening, when the noise of the day had faded and the sky outside my window had turned soft and dark, I thought about what had happened. Not just the meeting, but the inner movement. I realized I had spent many years believing that respect was mostly about how other people treated me. If they treated me well, I felt valued. If they didn't, I felt reduced. It was as if my sense of worth stood in the hands of whoever happened to be in front of me at that moment. But that quiet pause in the meeting, the space where I chose how to respond, showed me something different. Respect isn't only something we receive or lose. It's something we hold, something we practice from the inside out. We can't always control whether someone will test our dignity in public. Sometimes it's a comment in a meeting, sometimes a joke from a friend that goes a bit too far, sometimes a stranger's impatience in a line, sometimes a family member's careless words. These moments come uninvited. What we can choose, though, is what we do with our inner ground when it happens. As I reflected more deeply, I started to notice a pattern in myself. In the past, whenever I felt disrespected, I usually reacted in one of two ways. Sometimes I snapped back, sarcasm for sarcasm, sharpness for sharpness. Outwardly, it felt like reclaiming power. Inwardly, though, it always left a strange taste, like I had stepped slightly away from who I wanted to be. I would replay the incident later, not with pride, but with a quiet discomfort. I had defended my ego, but not really my peace. Other times, I shut down completely. I would smile weakly, laugh along, or say nothing at all. On the surface, this looked calm, but it wasn't strength. It was retreat. I would carry the hurt with me, letting it echo in my mind over and over, long after the moment had passed. I didn't lash out at anyone else, but I did quietly turn against myself. Neither extreme felt like true respect. Both were ways of handing over the steering wheel of my inner life to someone else's behavior, either by fighting them or by abandoning myself. That day in the meeting, something different had happened. I hadn't fought. I hadn't disappeared. I had stayed present. I had stayed visible to myself and to others, and I had answered in a way that aligned with the person I was trying to become. It was a very small moment from the outside, but from the inside, it felt like a subtle shift in direction. Over the next weeks, I began to pay attention to other people in public spaces, the way they handled small tensions, little frictions, tiny tests of respect. In cafes, offices, trains, shops, there were so many almost invisible examples. I saw someone at a coffee shop whose order had been mixed up. The barista looked overstretched and apologetic. The customer could have snapped. Instead, they paused, smiled, said, "No worries, I can wait," and step aside. No big performance, no self-righteousness. Just a soft choice not to add more harshness to an already strained moment. I saw a mother on a train with a restless child, enduring disapproving looks from strangers. Instead of reacting to every frown, she focused on her child, gently soothing, whispering stories, staying anchored in what mattered most. She didn't let the silent judgment around her shape the way she treated herself or her child. And I thought again of Keanu Reeves, how often people have commented on his quiet demeanor, his simple gestures of kindness, his patience in public situations. I don't know the full story of his inner life, nor do I pretend to, but I do know that when people speak of him, they often mention something else beyond the roles and the fame. They talk about presence, humility, a kind of grounded softness that doesn't get pulled too easily into the noise around him. Whether in a subway giving up his seat, in an interview answering uncomfortable questions with composure, or just standing aside to make room for others, it seems like he carries an understanding. How you treat others, even when they aren't at their best, is also a mirror of how at peace you are with yourself. Isn't that what quiet strength really looks like? Not the power to crush someone else in a moment of tension. Not the cleverness to win the exchange, but the courage to stay aligned with your own values, even when your pride is poked in public. As I reflected on all this, I began to understand that moments when respect is tested in public are not just about the other person being rude or insensitive. They are also invitations, uncomfortable ones, yes, but invitations nonetheless. They ask you, who are you when you are seen? Who are you when someone misjudges you? Who are you when your feelings are stirred in front of others? We often imagine strength as something loud and undeniable. But there is another kind of strength, one that moves quietly and doesn't announce itself. It's the strength to let your self-respect stay intact, even when someone else doesn't recognize it. This doesn't mean allowing mistreatment. Quiet strength isn't the same as allowing yourself to be walked over. It doesn't mean never speaking up or never setting boundaries. In fact, sometimes quiet strength is exactly what allows you to say, "That's not okay," in a calm, clear tone instead of an explosive one. The difference is where your worth is coming from. If your worth depends on winning every interaction, you'll always feel pulled into battles you didn't choose. You'll feel pushed to prove yourself, to correct every misunderstanding, to respond to every slight. Your peace will live in other people's hands. But if your worth is rooted somewhere deeper, in the simple recognition that you are human, learning, imperfect, and still deserving of kindness, then you begin to meet these moments differently. You stop asking, "How do I win this?" and start asking, "How do I stay true to myself here?" You begin to notice that not every comment needs an answer. Not every misunderstanding needs to be fixed in public. Not every disrespectful remark deserves the gift of your full energy. Sometimes the strongest response is a quiet redirection, back to the subject at hand, back to what matters, back to your own center. Sometimes it's a calm clarification, given without hate. Sometimes it's a simple, steady silence that says, "I heard what you said, but I am not required to become what you are throwing at me." Over time, this way of responding reshapes your relationship with yourself. You start to see that your dignity isn't as fragile as you once believed. It doesn't shatter under someone else's careless words. It might tremble, yes. It might sting. But it remains intact if you choose to keep holding it gently. And strangely, the more you protect your own inner respect without aggression, the easier it becomes to treat others with respect too, even when they stumble. You realize that you, too, have said clumsy things in public in the past. You, too, have made jokes that landed poorly, spoken from insecurity rather than wisdom, been impatient with someone who didn't deserve it. Remembering that softens you. It doesn't excuse bad behavior, but it keeps your heart from hardening. So when you see someone like Keanu Reeves responding to awkward or intrusive comments with patience instead of hostility, you sense that there is more going on than just politeness. There's a deep understanding. People are often speaking from their own hurt, their own confusion, their own longing to be seen or to be clever or to be important. Meeting that with more harm rarely heals anything. Of course, none of this is about being perfect. There will still be days when you react too sharply, or when you stay too silent and feel it later. There will be moments when your pride gets the better of your wisdom. That's part of being human. But each time you pause, each time you remember that small space between what you feel and what you choose, you strengthen a quiet muscle inside you. You learn to breathe, to observe yourself for a moment, to ask, What response, later, will I be at peace with? And often, the answer that comes isn't about winning the room. It's about respecting the person you have to live with long after everyone else has gone home, yourself. In a world that is often loud and reactive, where public moments are recorded, shared, and judged, there is something deeply powerful about someone who does not hurry to fight, to prove, or to perform. Someone who can let a small insult pass without absorbing it, or who can answer a cutting remark with a steady honesty rather than an equal cut. This kind of quiet strength doesn't make headlines. It doesn't look heroic in the usual sense, but it is the kind of strength that makes relationships healthier, workplaces calmer, and inner lives less turbulent. It starts in very ordinary rooms, offices, living rooms, classrooms, streets, trains. It happens in seconds. A look, a word, an interrupting comment, a careless laugh. And then, if you're paying attention, it opens a little doorway where you can step into yourself more fully. You don't always walk through that doorway perfectly, but it's there. So the next time you feel your respect being tested in public, when someone dismisses your idea, mocks your effort, questions your worth, or speaks to you in a way that tightens your chest, see if you can do one simple thing: notice the space. The space between the sting and the response. It might be small at first, barely long enough for a breath. But in that breath, you can ask silently, what would a quiet strength look like here? It may look like standing your ground with a calm voice. It may look like asking a sincere question instead of making a defensive statement. It may look like choosing not to respond at all, not from fear, but from discernment. It may look like saying, later and in private, when you said that, it didn't feel respectful. Can we talk about it? Whatever it looks like, it will be yours. Chosen, not forced. Rooted, not reactive. Respect, then, is no longer just something you demand from others. It becomes something you practice, toward yourself, toward them, and toward the shared space between you. And slowly, you come to understand what that calm, unshaken presence you once observed in someone else was really pointing to. True strength doesn't always stand in the spotlight. Often, it stands quietly inside you, in the simple, steady decision not to let a passing act of disrespect decide the kind of person you will be. When respect is tested in public, it is really your private relationship with yourself that is being invited to grow. And in that quiet, unseen place, you begin to learn that dignity is less about how loudly you defend it, and more about how gently and consistently you live it.